the death of George Floyd was able to allow a movement to break through that it was not new. It had been around for many decades, but it happened at a time during the lockdowns when people's attention was really available. He became something, a meme and a symbol of a kind of everlasting white supremacy that became very expedient for people whose lives tended to look nothing like George Floyd's to use and to manipulate. Democrats and Republicans in America should have been able to come together and say, we can't have people burning down our cities. You know, it wasn't just Minneapolis at all. Kenosha, Wisconsin, where the fiery but mostly peaceful protest Chiron was, I mean, that was an insane kind of uprising that went on. You know, people's car lots were burned, millions of dollars of damage, billions of dollars of damage nationwide.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Thomas Chatterton Williams. Thomas, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's wonderful to have you on. I really want to talk to you about your new book, which is causing a bit of a stir. I think it's safe to say. I've read some of the reviews, I've seen some of the response, some of it good, some of it great, some of it slightly critical. We can get into a bit of that as well. I thought it was excellent. It's called Summer of Our Discontent, The Age of Certainty and the Demise of Discourse. Great Shakespearean title for a book that actually touches on, you know, kind of Shakespearean themes in the size of them. In a nutshell, your book is about the George Floyd moment and the fallout from it. Everything that happened in 2020 in the United States and the consequences that it had for America. And it really kind of distills all of that stuff very well. But I guess I'll kick off by asking you how significant you think that moment was. I think we all have a tendency, certainly us outsiders looking at the US, we know the George Floyd thing was very important. We know that murder was incredibly shocking. We know that there were riots subsequent to it. I think there is a bit of a tendency to see it as a kind of blip in America, a weird event in that weird year of lockdown and COVID and everything else. But you try to historicize it. You try to present it to us as an epoch-defining event, an event that expressed the epoch we're in and also helped to reshape it. So give us a sense of how important you think the George Floyd moment was or even is.
Oh, I think it was just enormous. You know, you had this breakthrough for the social justice movement with the terrible video that emerged of George Floyd's slow death in Minneapolis, but it happened at a time during the lockdowns when people's attention was really available. So, you know, Floyd was, I think, extraordinarily significant, but not in a vacuum. It couldn't have been nearly so significant if you didn't have the confluence of the pandemic and this very heightened election campaign going on with Donald Trump seeking to be a two-term president, and the feeling on the left and throughout much of the country that, you know, democracy was really in peril, and so that this was the most significant election of our lifetimes, if not in the history of the country. You know, it was a very hyperbolic moment. So at this particular time, the death of George Floyd was able to spark, it was able to allow a movement to break through that it was not new. It had been around for many decades. You know, critical race theory, a lot of ideas that were percolating on the left and gaining traction in 2020 had been around for a long time, but they broke through. So I think it is still extremely important. We cannot really understand the backlash that we are living through right now, and, you know, the redemption and reelection of Donald Trump and the kind of ongoing campaign of punishment that he's enacting for a large part of the country that wants to see what happened in 2020 reversed, and not just reversed, but really humiliated. So that can only be understood in tandem with what came before. So I think, you know, there's a tendency to memory hole or to try to like downplay or say that, you know, what happened in 2020 wasn't really that important, because I think it serves the left to just say we need to concentrate on the emergency right now of Donald Trump. But that gets it exactly wrong. You know, I think the way to think about it is like a plane crash. You do want to focus on the actual casualties and the damage that a plane crash causes, but you really do have to find that black box and understand what went wrong. And so I think, you know, examining 2020 and the kind of Pyrrhic victories that were enacted at that moment is imperative for understanding why there is such a reactionary populist backlash going on now.
Yeah, I want to come back to the backlash question a little later because in a different way, we're experiencing something very similar in the UK. So I want to touch on that in a bit. But let's go back to 25th of May 2020. This terrible event happens. George Floyd is murdered by a police officer. You have a really interesting description of it in your book. You call it a vertical crucifixion, which I thought
Horizontal,
was a
yeah.
horizontal. Yes, sorry, yeah. Vertical would be the original crucifixion. A horizontal crucifixion, and it's a very striking phrase. And you describe the impact of that image, and it had a global impact. It was extraordinary. I remember being completely horrified by it, as was
Yeah.
everyone I know, and we're thousands of miles away. Um, Talk to us a bit about what that moment was like for you. There's a part in the book where you said y- people remember where they were on 11th of September, and lots of people, including you, also remember where you were when you first saw this image. What was the impact of that image on you, and I guess on America more broadly?
I remember we were quarantined in France. My children are French, and my family and I were at a friend's home on the west coast of France for a few months. And so, we were very fortunate to be able to work remotely. And I was borrowing an office in the house, and I went upstairs with my coffee, as I did every morning, and checked Twitter. And I just started seeing this video, like on the third instance of it. I clicked on it and I just couldn't believe what I saw. I mean, there were so many videos that circulated of, unfortunately, of mostly black men um, being killed by police and vigilantes for several years before that. In the age of social media, those types of videos proliferated. But this was really different. The visual language of this was different because I think we got kind of accustomed to seeing um, shootings, but this slow, drawn out death where, multiple bystanders are trying to persuade the cop, to Derek Chauvin, to stop, and he just doesn't, and it goes on and on and on, and Floyd is calling for his mother. I mean, it really struck me as something that we were witnessing something bad, really bad. But I actually was still surprised, as I was up 6 hours before the East Coast of the United States. And as the day went on, and as America began to wake up and the video started to really circulate in America, I really couldn't believe how viral it was going. It seemed like something categorically different than the other videos that had preceded it. And so, I felt that that type of response was justified, though I felt like what we had seen was so out of the ordinary that it really had to be condemned. So at that moment, it made sense to me as the kind of reaction to the video wore on over the weeks and months. It started to seem to me that um, something was not just different, but this video was being used for any number of purposes that didn't quite make sense. I remember one of the first things that really struck me was that, like, if you were a student at Oxford University in the United Kingdom, Oxford University, where they have students from all over the world, you could say that you were too troubled by the video to sit for your exams. You could have special consideration in your final exams. But at the same time, there was, an extraordinary civil war in Syria going on, where 600,000 people were killed, and, all types of numbers of people were displaced, or, there's a genocide in China of the ethnic Uyghurs. And, like, there's any number of tragedies, not to diminish what happened to Floyd, but it seemed like something else was going on that really was hard to wrap my mind around, about why this one singular death so captivated the entire world. And so then I really wanted to try to understand what dynamics were at play there.
Yeah, I remember that moment so well. And students in the UK saying, I can't do my exam because George Floyd was killed. And across Europe, there was an extraordinary response along those lines as well. Um, that brings me to a question I wanted to ask about what is George Floyd? Because you've got this section in the book where you talk about the two George Floyds. There's the man himself. You make this very pertinent point that not just a black man, but a poor man, a man from a difficult background, living in difficult circumstances. a son, a brother, a normal human being in all those ways that we are all normal human beings. And then there's the other George Floyd, which is the meme, the person who became a global meme, immortalized, as you describe it, as the horizontal crucifixion. This image that went around the world and came to mean, I guess, different things for different people, and even different things for different nations. I mean, even in
Yeah.
Australia, Aboriginal people marched behind the Black Lives Matter banner at a certain point. So it became a kind of boost to different campaigns, different ideas, different SJW approaches to politics, and so on. Um, it seems to me that the right has a tendency to focus rather too much on the man, and there's developed this idea that he was a petty criminal. He kind of had it coming. I mean, some of them get close to saying that, if not outright say it. And then, of course, there are sections of the left who focus entirely on the immortalized image, and it comes to mean different things for different people, depending, I guess, on what their political and moral needs might be. How do you cut through those two George Floyds to get a sense of who that person really was and what that event really meant in its kind of specific sense?
I mean, yeah, George Floyd was a he had a Black experience that I don't wanna say, you know, was completely unique, but it is not the definitive Black experience, and I would say it's a minority Black experience at this time in the country's development. He was um, certainly poor in ways that are not able to be fully extricated from his racial identity, but they don't define his racial identity. Most Black people don't live in such circumstances. Clearly, most Black people are not criminals. Most Black people would never pass a counterfeit note, which is the ludicrous kind of petty crime that started the whole thing. Most Black people are not addicted to drugs. So most Black people never are complicit in a robbery and pistol whipping of a pregnant woman, which he was. He was he was a loved but also flawed human being. He is not a stand-in for the Black experience, though he's certainly a product of the Black experience here, which is shot through with a tragic kind of historical oppression that has not been transcended yet. At the same time, he became something, a meme and a symbol of a kind of um, everlasting white supremacy that became very expedient for people whose lives tended to look nothing like George Floyd's to use and to manipulate oftentimes in the workspace or in elite academic spaces. So that was what also intrigued me, was that, George Floyd died, therefore you need to fund my Broadway play, or George Floyd died, therefore I have to be admitted into Harvard University now. This was really what is going on. George Floyd died. The thing that really blew my mind was there was an instance in America at what is called the Poetry Foundation, and its flagship product is Poetry Magazine. It happens to be an institution with a $257 million endowment from the Eli Lilly pharmaceutical fortune. So it's not chump change. And George Floyd died, and within days, a group of poets did a hostile takeover of that endowment, essentially said that, in a world where George Floyd can die like this, in a world where there's a Black genocide, really getting into a kind of hyperbolic language, you need to the chairman of the board and the editor-in-chief must step down and be replaced by either us or our allies, and we must have like full control over the endowment. And the organization capitulated. And I never could square that. In what way does, the Poetry Foundation's $250 million endowment being reallocated to very elite um, Black poets and their friends, in what way does that make whole the kind of American subaltern that can be broken in the streets by police the way that Floyd was broken? It doesn't seem to me that that's the way that you actually address whatever happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis. But that was the kind of immediate reflex that was going on around the country. So there was this kind of this really sad and highly specific death of a man, and then there was this kind of image and symbol that really had a kind of power to be used for ends within elite institutions and social contexts that I think really was instrumental in inspiring this backlash.
You talk in the book about, I guess we could call it the speeding up of identity politics in the George Floyd aftermath, which you've touched on there. We had it in the UK as well. I mean, shortly after the killing of George Floyd, the then Archbishop of Canterbury issued a decree saying that all churches have to look for any symbols of slavery or colonialism and take them
Right.
out of their churches. He said that they need to atone, people need to atone for, Christians need to atone for their sins of whiteness. I mean, there was all this kind of religiously infused terminology and discussion. And there was some of that in the US as well, where there was this outburst, seemed to me, of, I guess, a kind of elite Black victimhood. So not necessarily people who are actually victims, but people who spoke in that language, alongside a kind of explosion of white self-loathing, where it became the
Yeah.
fashionable thing, if you were a columnist or an activist or an artist and you were white, that you had to claim some kind of moral culpability for what happened to George Floyd. So it seemed that those two things really came to a head. I guess the politics of Black victimhood and the politics of white self-hatred. Um, is that what played out in the US? I mean, to what extent can the George Floyd moment be seen as an attempt to institutionalize what had been a kind of campus phenomenon to a certain extent, identity politics, the SJW outlook? Did that get institutionalized on the back of this moment?
It definitely got institutionalized for actually, in retrospect, a shorter amount of time than I think most of
Yeah.
us assumed at the moment. It didn't last very long. I think that you could really say that that moment ended on October 7th, 2023. It was dead after that, um, especially in America. But the death of George Floyd, and we talked about the way it appeared in the visual language as a horizontal crucifixion. It tapped into this kind of um, this religious impulse that undergirds a lot of anti-racism. The idea that whiteness is a form of original sin. And so there's this type of white guilt that was, Robin DiAngelo published White Fragility several years before, but it really broke through again and definitively in 2020. This idea that whites need to make up for the original sin of whiteness through anti-racist efforts, and gurus like Ibram X. Kendi and DiAngelo could teach whites the way to do that. But I don't think that was self-loathing. Actually, I think that also is it's a kind of form of narcissism. And one of the things that really always bothered me about not the anti-racism of Dr. King, but the anti-racism with quotes on it that became a kind of self-help for a certain type of liberal white, because there's no self-loathing in it. You have this original sin of whiteness, and you have to, do things to signal that you're aware of that and you're transcending it. But at the same time, you are you're the principal agent and actor in
Yep.
world history and in the culture of your society. And so, blacks are kind of supporting characters in your own moral development. And that really became the energy behind this. And I think that it was very short-sighted of people who genuinely care about social reform to attach their movement to something so fickle as the self-improvement and moral betterment of white people in a way that's very reminiscent of self-help fads. So that's why the truly liberal reaction to George Floyd's death, I always argued, would be to say that all of us should invest in the principle that police should not be able to break a man like this, that police brutality is unjustified, unacceptable wherever it manifests. The primary fact of this is not that the police officer was white and George Floyd was black, but that this is unacceptable, and we should be just as outraged when it happens to a white man, which it did happen in 2016 in Dallas, almost an identical death with a man named Tony Timpa, where it was videotaped, police officers kneeling on him saying, "I can't breathe," them laughing, and he died. But that didn't catch on in the public imagination. And so I think we would have actually had a much more successful movement had we just been against that type of action, that type of behavior along universal principles, and everybody should have felt implicated in it, not because you for the moment are posting a black square on Instagram and caring about black lives and saying they matter, but because you permanently buy into this position and you're implicated in it as an American, and we all reject that this can happen to another American or another human being.
Very well put. I really agree that behind that kind of white self-loathing or that performative anti-whiteness
Performative.
that's often pushed, that's often pushed by white people, there lurks a kind of real puffed up sense of self-righteousness.
Yes.
We are the enlightened ones. We're more enlightened than the white riffraff. And also we are the authors of our nation's destiny in a way that black people aren't. So we have to do all this stuff. I mean, there's a real kind of racial paternalism and class paternalism to a lot
Yes.
of that performative politics. Okay, so then we have the explosion of violence in the US, riots across America, just the most extraordinary sight. Um, what's your take on that? You obviously you discuss this at length in the book, but to what extent do you think that violence was like the militant wing of this politics you've just touched on there? I mean, or was it just something a bit more chaotic and nihilistic and opportunistic and in some ways inevitable? Or was it a kind of an armed enforcement of this new, as you say, quite short-lived institutionalized identity politics? What do you think was going on the streets?
I think it was all of that. I think, again, you can't extricate the racial reckoning from the pandemic. I think there was a widespread urge to rebel against something, and it manifested in different ways. People were very frustrated we had 2 weeks to flatten the curve, right? That's what we were told at the
Sure.
beginning. And then people's businesses were shut down for months. People missed their people. I know people who couldn't bury their parents, who couldn't be physically present with a dying parent, couldn't give them a proper funeral. I mean, people were very frustrated and were being um, pulled out of regular life. On the right, this manifested as a kind of protest movement against stay-at-home orders, and that was considered very politically unrespectable, and it was linked to support for Donald Trump by the mainstream. So people were shamed for this type of protest until May 25th. When George Floyd died, from one day to the next, people were shamed for now not being in the street because public health officials were even promoting the idea that racism is another kind of pandemic, perhaps even deadlier than COVID-19. And so one risk cannot be juxtaposed against the other, but one must support those who go out in the street, and one must even admit that we might have an imperative to be out in the street. So then suddenly it became fashionable to rebel. But I think the impulse to rebel was always there. But this became the respectable outlet for that drive that everybody was feeling, and so it got channeled that way. And then you have the kind of the crimes of opportunity. A lot of people were looting that had no activist agenda, that were, of any variety of racial backgrounds. In Soho and downtown Manhattan, fancy stores were being looted, and people were, speaking on the record while looting, saying, I don't think this has anything to do with anti-racism. I think we're just getting some shoes right now. People were getting shot because, it was chaotic, as you say. But then there was that paternalistic kind of elite discourse above it that had nothing to do with what was actually going on the ground, but that said, well, looting is actually the language of the unheard. So who are we to condemn it? And that, I think, was really, really scandalous and really has had lasting consequences. You had respectable liberal mainstream organizations like NPR, National Public Radio, sitting down to give these kind of breathless interviews with, very privileged white authors of books like In Defense of Looting. We can have things for free if we just realize that, that's a way of liberating Black and brown people and indigenous people. This was actually said. And I can't overstate what kind of effect that had, I think, on the rest of the country, saying, wait a minute, I didn't bury my dad. Now you're
Mm.
saying that anybody like in defense of racial justice can just walk in a Walmart and take a washing machine? I think that
Mm.
in the book, I try to make this clear. It didn't cause January 6th, but I do think that a nation watching that for months on end, said, well, they just justified a whole lot of this stuff, so I'm going to do what I want. I think these things are intertwined.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of intertwining, what do you think was the relationship between that kind of elite discourse in defense of looting, or you have a chapter in the book which takes its title from the CNN line, mostly peaceful protests or
Fiery but
whatever it was.
mostly peaceful
Yeah,
protests and the
fiery
man
but
is standing in front of a blazing building.
yeah, fiery but mostly peaceful. Um, And then, of course, also in elite institutions and elite publications, there was the phenomenon of people being sacked because they weren't going entirely along with the BLM line, or they
That's
were
right.
calling into question the idea that black men in America were suffering from a genocide. You know, if you questioned any of these kind of gospel truths of the new identity politics, you could get into trouble in certain elite institutions. What was the relationship between that stuff that was going on higher up in the opinion shaping sections of society and what was happening on the streets? Do you think was there a tie between those two things? Were they connected?
I don't think that the people in the streets were really reading the New York Times or watching CNN. I really think that there were two different things happening, and I think it was really an abdication of responsibility from our institutional leaders. I think it's really shameful the way that organizations conducted themselves in places that are supposed to guide society. Not that they could necessarily stop, but they should never have condoned. I think that that was actually that and some of the messaging around public health, the flip-flopping on whether you mask, the incoherent messaging around vaccines, I think that actually uh, expertise really suffered in lasting ways that are making us all less safe now. They hemorrhaged their authority. But I don't think that it actually caused the rioting. But I do, I do think that it made the political response, it prevented it from being unified. Democrats and Republicans in America should have been able to come together and say, we can't have, you know, um, people burning down our cities. It wasn't just Minneapolis at all. Kenosha, Wisconsin, where the fiery but mostly peaceful protest Chiron was. I mean, that was an insane kind of uprising that went on. People's car lots were burned, millions of dollars of billions of dollars of damage nationwide. Portland, Oregon was, a scene of unrest and conflict between Antifa and other rioters and the police for over 100 days. Lasting damage, lasting distrust in the city's downtown that still goes on to this day. We should have been able on the left and the right to say that this is unacceptable. But I think that that kind of inability to have a unified response allowed it to perpetuate, but I don't think that it directly inspired the action.
One thing I wanted to ask you was about how different these riots were to earlier race riots in the US. I mean, riots are always bad, they're always destructive, and it tends to be working class and poor communities that suffer most. Um, but how different was the 2020 moment from, say, the Watts riots in the 60s or even the Los Angeles riots in the early 1992, I think? Um, would you say that those older riots were more political? I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot, but maybe even more understandable in terms of a kind of instinctive rage against palpable injustices. Whereas the riots of 2020 seem to be co-opted very quickly or clung on to very quickly by elite white elements, influencers, even the billionaire classes who really institutionalized the BLM idea through social media networks and so on. And it became almost a way to refresh the reputation of capitalism itself. How different do you think that moment in 2020 was from earlier uprisings by African Americans in the US?
I think you put that really well. The Watts riots, for example, or the riots that, engulfed Newark, New Jersey, or Detroit, things that James Baldwin has written about in Harlem. Um, these were responses, however out of control they got. These were responses to a kind of oppression that simply does not exist in 2025. That's off the top, that's for sure. Um, but the thing that really struck me about this moment was the degree to which it was co-opted, oftentimes by whites who were LARPing as activists or as allies. And you had this strange thing that I don't believe you could find. I don't want nothing under the sun is new, and you can probably find evidence of anything, especially if it's really stupid. But there was a lot of videotaped evidence of Black people actually in 2020 attempting to persuade white people to stop breaking things and to stop writing BLM on the sides of businesses and things. And, you have black people saying, this is not a black person doing this. I want to get on the record. They're going to come back and they're going to punish us. Stop. Please don't deface that business. We are going to bear the brunt of this. And actually, sometimes you had a kind of extraordinary interaction where a very entitled white activist would tell the black person basically to pipe down, that don't get in the way of my liberating black people. It was a very, very strange time. And I do think that's kind of new. And then you have this other thing that didn't exist then, which is another component of the entire era in which we live, which is that there's this technological component, social media, and the fact that everybody walks around with, both a high quality video camera in their pocket, as well as the means to distribute video and self-publish globally. So everybody is kind of also performing activism in a way and filming themselves involved in it. So there's a kind of superficial, kind of almost fake role-playing aspect to this that I don't know that always existed in the past, by both blacks and whites, but especially by kind of interlopers that just wanted to, post content to social media. There's this kind of spectacular element to it. And you really saw this actually as it started to evolve and the right got involved in January 6th, this kind of fake, weird, can I even believe what I'm seeing insurrection at the nation's capital, where these people were both rioting and taking over the Capitol, but also kind of marveling that they were actually inside and taking tourist-like photos and selfies of themselves because they almost couldn't believe that it was real. And so they had to record and disseminate the evidence of it. There's this kind of air of superficiality attached to all of 2020 that also differentiates it, I think, from more authentic social movements in the past that also had real leadership. That's the other thing. Black Lives Matter always kind of differentiated itself by having no top-down leadership structure, but that also meant it was anything for anyone. Whereas the civil rights movement was very disciplined. Even if there were elements of violence that got out of control, it had an articulated vision, it had real asks that it conveyed to society, and it had spokespeople that took responsibility. None of that was the case in 2020.
The other thing that strikes me is that you have a section in your book on Jussie Smollett. I have to ask you about this because I find it so intriguing, as do many people. But it seems to me, when I was reading that another difference between the civil rights movement and the post-2020 moment is that in the past, those movements were about overcoming oppression. I mean, we shall overcome. It's that, it says it on the tin. Whereas often today you have movements or organizations or individuals who almost covet oppression and go looking for it. Often people who live actually very, very charmed lives. But there's a social currency to victimhood now. And you mentioned earlier the hyperbolic claims that were made after the George Floyd moment about black genocide, the police wiping out all black men, etc. It's almost like the way in which you establish yourself as someone to pay attention to these days is not by exercising your autonomy and your independence and proving that you are capable of being equal to other people in society, but the opposite, by demonstrating weakness, victimhood. And it's really summed up in the Jussie Smollett moment, the famous actor who pretended to have been almost lynched by some Trumpist type people. I mean, a really crazy moment. What do you think that told us, I guess, about racial politics and about the victim element to some racial politics today?
Yeah. I mean, well, first and foremost, I think there have been several of these types of instances, but his was by far the most ludicrous. We actually aren't manufacturing enough genuine oppression anymore. So we have to actually, go out and farm some and create artificial instances of oppression because we aren't getting enough organically. That's true. There just isn't enough of that kind of thing happening in society. Not to say it never happens, but they have to go out and look for it. You can look at that two ways. I take some that leaves me feeling kind of optimistic. My dad was born in 1937 in the segregated South. Texas lynched just as much or more than any other state in the United States of America. I mean, you could get lynched in my father's lifetime. It was no joke. And at that time, the people that were fabricating stories were like the white woman who made up the story that this young black boy whistled at her and catcalled her and led to the lynching of Emmett Till. The kind of fabrication of grievance went in the other direction. So I think, we can all be optimistic that Jussie Smollett had to create his own oppression. But I also want to say that it's emblematic of something larger in our society, which is that the role of the victim is the preeminent status role
Yeah.
across society. It is also within the kind of white movement that Donald Trump has tapped into. There is this element, Donald Trump is the kind of aggrieved white man par excellence, and he taps into something that J.D. Vance also has tapped into in recent years, which is that, look, wokeness essentially, it's a stupid word, but it's the word that we have to describe this constellation of behaviors and attitudes. And it's something that really has defined the left in recent years, but there's elements of a woke right. And wokeness, I say, is fundamentally, if Marxism is the redistribution of wealth, wokeness is the redistribution of status and recognition through competing claims of grievance. And so everybody is trying to stake out their own grievance claim, every identity group. And you have the kind of capture of grievance by usually the elites in that group, the kind of people that actually have embraced Trumpism the most and the kind of take back America the most are not actually the poorest and least powerful whites in America. They're a level or more up from that. They're people that actually don't have genuine grievance, but are actually losing recognition vis-a-vis other groups and are kind of reacting to that. The kind of blacks that have really embraced grievance politics are not usually the poorest and most vulnerable blacks. Those they're the kind of elites that are talking about a genocide and that are taking over the Poetry Foundation or manufacturing instances of oppression like Jussie Smollett, whereas the black working class and the Latino working class is the group of voters that have actually moved over towards Donald Trump more than they've embraced the wokeness that's emblematic of the kind of activist left progressive class that captured the Democrats. So it's a very interesting kind of dynamic that's going on across society, where there's a status grab through competing claims of victimization Olympics, we call it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Jussie
It's so
Smollett
true.
would be like a world-class Olympic athlete,
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
got
He's the
caught
winner.
doping, who got caught doping.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. No, I often think that, working class communities just do not benefit from the performance of victimhood because they're too busy trying to make ends meet and trying to get jobs and trying to work and trying to keep a roof over their heads. And for those things, you need the virtues of strength and
And they
autonomy and
often have a
determination.
culture of honor where they find
Yeah.
it insulting to say that they
Yeah.
have no agency or control over their own lives. Whereas you have these people that are produced by Harvard, Yale, and Oxford who claim to have no agency
Yeah.
and to
It's
be at the
extraordinary.
mercy of structures.
Yeah. Yeah. um, I just want to ask you quickly about BLM and where BLM is at, or the future of BLM. I mean, it seems to have slightly disappeared from the public consciousness to a certain extent. One thing that struck me after 2020 was just there was an irony to it because BLM presents itself as this kind of post-colonial, anti-colonial, anti-American movement. But actually, it seemed to me to become almost one of the most successful exports of the soft power of the United States. I mean,
Exactly.
it moved like a juggernaut around the world. It was extraordinary. It was really brought home to me. There was a BLM protest in London, and some of the marchers put their hands up in the air saying, "Don't shoot," but our cops don't even have guns. It was just this.
I know.
It was just this importing of an American slogan, and we saw that across Europe, in
In Paris,
Belgium.
yeah.
Everywhere, Paris, and Australia, as I mentioned earlier. I don't think there were any BLM protests in China or Korea or those kinds of places, but it was a global phenomenon exported by social media billionaires and popular culture and even politicians. Keir Starmer famously took the knee. He's now our prime minister, of course. Um, what the hell was that? What was that what was that organization about? It claims to be one thing, it seems to be a different thing entirely. What do you think BLM as an organization was about?
Well, as an organization, it was about enriching some of the people that came up with the really catchy marketing slogan. We have a situation in America where numerous mothers of victims of police and vigilante violence have demanded that Patrice Cullors and others who founded Black Lives Matter TM, that they've demanded they stop using their children's name to keep enriching themselves. There's been financial reporting that shows that they've bought multiple homes for themselves, $1 million homes. Just real like basic level financial mismanagement and worse. Self enrichment, hiring your brother for a $500,000 a year consulting job at Black Lives Matter. We still don't know how much money they took in. For a moment, there was such a flood of donations. There have been differing estimates. Some put it in the billions. I think it's safe to say certainly in the hundreds of millions. Even somebody like Ibram X. Kendi, he raised that year, that 2020, 2021, he raised $53 million for his Center for Anti-Racism. I mean, in one fell tweet, Jack Dorsey, the creator of Twitter, just tweeted out $10 million to Ibram X. Kendi, no strings, Black Lives Matter, That was the culture that we were in. So money was flying. We don't know where it went. But what they did is what's as American as apple pie. They created a very salient marketing mechanism, and it caught on. And I don't want to be completely dismissive of it, because nothing that works that way can be completely phony. Where I live for part of the year in Paris, you had Black Lives Matter really catching on. You had thousands of people take to the streets, and they chanted in English, "I can't breathe." And these things, they gave them a vocabulary and I don't think it was a vocabulary that fully is capable of describing French society, which is not based on slavery within the metropole. France had slaves, but they were always in the colonies. They don't have a society that has a kind of one-drop rule based on either being black or white or free or unfree within their society. So these things don't completely fit well. But they did these movements, these American ways of talking about Black Lives Mattering. It gave them a language to describe a lack of recognition that they felt is prevalent in their own society. And so I can get that on some level. I think they have to develop their own language. And I think that what this was marketing the way that Jay-Z is marketing, or the way that LeBron James is marketing. And, America continues to, this is what the French have always hated about America. It continues to impose its culture on other societies, whether they want it or not. They have to drink Coca-Cola. It's like Black Lives Matter was like Coca-Cola in that way. That moment was so weird. They had a march against whiteness in Finland, if I'm not mistaken. This is a place that they have oppressed nobody through whiteness in Finland. It's like over 97% ethnically the same, this tiny kind of white. But they had a march for Black Lives Matter, against racism in South Korea. This moment was also a kind of mass psychosis. I really think we were living in a moment that was almost outside of time during this pandemic, where people lost all sense of perspective. So something really catchy like that could just be a meme that was a way of giving people also community. I think people used Black Lives Matter at a moment when they needed to have some type of community, and they adapted it to whatever the needs of their society were at that time.
Yeah, reading your book kind of brought out the old leftist in me at parts, because you talk about the poor black man, George Floyd, troubled, flawed, poor man, and then the kind of enrichment of others on the back of BLM, whether that's moral enrichment or economic enrichment, and it kind of is an infuriating moment, I think, in American and world history. Okay, one of the things your book's been criticized for is spending more time criticizing the woke, the left, rather than the kind of populist right and the reaction. And we have now done the exact same thing on this podcast, because I'm going to now spend the last part of the podcast asking you about the reaction to it. I do think the woke stuff is just more interesting, and for a period of time at least was much more influential. So I do think it's worth focusing on that and tearing it apart as you do, analyzing it as you do in your book. So let's talk about just a couple of things I want to ask you in relation to this. First, about 6th of January 2021, which you've already mentioned. Um, some people have said that you have almost offered an apology for it or an explanation for it as a response to the post 2020 moment. I think some people would go so far as to say you're excuse making for it, which you're not, and that's clear in the book. But what do you think is the relationship between the fallout from George Floyd, the riots of 2020, and then we get to early 2021, and there is this kind of very strange, surreal storming of the Capitol by Trump supporters? What do you think is the relationship between those two things?
Yeah. Well, first, I just want to say one of the reasons to spend a disproportionate amount of time on the left is to speak to people who are persuadable. The cult of Trump and MAGA, these people are essentially out of reach. They're not listening to, liberal arguments, and they're not capable of being persuaded through rational thought. They've made that very clear. So the reason for critiquing the left is because that still is the side that I believe uh, is persuadable, if anybody is reachable, especially people. This book is marketed towards anybody on the center right to the left. It's also, they're very responsible conservatives. They have no power on the right. But with that said, 20-30% of the book is an argument against Donald Trump, because I think that is the foremost threat to our democracy right now, this kind of right-wing authoritarianism. Yet I don't think that, I just don't see how you can have a valid response to Trumpism, to the attractiveness for if not a majority, a plurality of American voters of his vision, if you don't treat it as something that comes within a context. People want to talk about it as though it exists in a vacuum. And I really don't think Donald Trump could have come back and regained power and increased his own multi-ethnic coalition of support without the kind of extraordinary excesses that made the Democrats and the left look less attractive than a would-be dictator when they were given the choice between the two. I mean, if you can't self-reflect on where you erred, I just don't see how you can ever really understand what you're up against, why Americans find him compelling. So with that said, January 6th is inexcusable. I try to say that so many ways in the book. So it's very frustrating when people, you get the impression that there's a kind of review like the one that was published in The Guardian where they already know the conclusion before they've opened the book. So you've really wasted like 3-4 years of your life writing something for that type of a reviewer. But the point that I am making is you can't expect people to be impervious to very cynical propaganda, which I believe they received from Trump and from, some of the more violent and anti-democratic supporters of his, that they should take back their society by any means necessary. You can't think that people can just be impervious to that kind of appeal when they have spent the better part of the past year watching the most prestigious institutions in the country say that there are times in which you have to just take to the streets and litigate political disagreements through violence and through pure force. You can't expect them to see that from the left and then think that that should always be out of bounds when they believe that they possess the moral clarity. I think it's a very dangerous thing to ever excuse making politics in the streets through violence, because you don't know how to contain that once you let that, once you open that box. And I think the left was very naive about that they would always possess either the moral authority or that they would always possess control of the political institutions. And so they would just be able to impose their idea of moral clarity. The book takes a lot of time to talk about why moral clarity is a real juvenile way of thinking about society and politics. I would think that ISIS has its own kind of idea of moral clarity. I bet that they believe when they're beheading people and throwing gay people off of roofs that they're coming from a place of moral clarity. The problem with moral clarity is that it's subjective. That's the fundamental insight of liberalism that we've inherited from European societies going back centuries, is that we got to get out of the subjective and get into as close to the universal as possible through principles through values, through ideas that everybody can buy into, due process, maximal tolerance for opposing views, negotiation. I can't impose my view on you through force. We have to come to some type of consensus. That's the fundamental insight of a liberal society, and we keep seeming to have to relearn this lesson. But in recent years, it was the left that really was able to impose its vision and its will on a right that oftentimes the left was not even able to understand was as numerous as it was, because they were so dominant that people falsified their preferences. That's the other thing that the book tries to make clear. Cancel culture and all this stuff that was going on is not just bad and wrong and mean. It actually is pragmatically very, very short-sighted. You get in a situation where every single election for the past 3 elections, you're continuously surprised by how much support Donald Trump has, because people don't tell you what they really think. So preference falsification is really dangerous. And so all of that stuff came together. And that's a very long way of answering your question. But January 6th is, I think, the worst thing that has happened politically this century. At least this century. It is reprehensible. But you're just kidding yourself if you think it happened in a vacuum, and that Donald Trump is a figure that came on the scene without being a figure that very shrewdly juxtaposed himself to the dominant culture and gave people an alternate vision that they actually found more attractive. And so you must do some self-reflection when somebody like that, as risible as he is, as unqualified as he is, appeals more than what you were offering.
Yeah, I think it's so true. It's a lesson that the left has yet to learn, I think, which is that if you let street violence out of the bag, then it could very well be turned against you at some point. If you let censorship out of the bag, that will certainly be
Absolutely.
weaponized against you in the future. There's, that's one of the great history lessons of history. Um, and of course, the other side of this is if you let the politics of race out of the bag, that will
Yes.
also be adopted by your opponents and your enemies. And that's the thing I wanted to touch on with you, because it does seem to me that the hyper-racial politics of identity that sections of the left have embraced with great fervor over the past few years, one thing that always worried me about it was not only that it rehabilitated racial thinking, which I think is a bad idea, but also it seemed to me so clear that it would hand an opportunity to sections of the right who are likewise beholden to a racial way of seeing the world, and sometimes an even uglier racial way of seeing the world. We're seeing something like this in the UK, where there's now a backlash against the ideology of multiculturalism. I would be very critical of the ideology of multiculturalism because I think it's separatist and divisive, and it fails to unify all our communities around a shared national idea. But the reaction against it is taking ethno-nationalist terms. It's ethno-narcissist. There's now this argument, relatively common argument, that you can't be British unless you're white.
Yeah.
All these things which are, a pretty predictable backlash against that kind of racial leftism that preceded it. How's that playing out in the US? And how does someone like you, and how do liberals, I guess, people who still hold to liberal ideals, how do they push back against this pincer movement of
Yeah.
racial politics that's coming from the left and the right?
Fetishizing racial difference was always a very ill-conceived idea of attaining racial justice and equality. The civil rights movement in America laid out the blueprint. You appeal to people's better angels by saying that you want to participate fully in society and be equal, not that you want a special place for yourself based on immutable characteristics. That was always the most effective way to go about bringing genuine equality. We actually had, a great achievement in American society, which was that it really did become disreputable, not among all white people, but among large numbers of white people. It was disreputable to publicly declare that you would organize based on your own racial ethno interests as an ethnic group, as whites, as such. That was disreputable. And we really reached the kind of apotheosis of a movement towards trying to transcend our past oppressions and biases in the early days of the election of Barack Obama. The nation did seem, not everybody, there was certainly always a backlash baked in, but the nation did seem to really want to give a go at transcending race, at maybe even becoming this kind of um, this now detested term post-racial. But then that wasn't good enough, and there was a disillusionment that Barack Obama didn't heal all of our wounds, and you started to have this kind of new social justice activism that really fetishized and dug its heels into racial difference, and there was only a matter of time that you could do that, I think, in a country that is majority white. That is still white people still have the numbers, still have a lot of the social power. You could only organize a politics around everybody having racial and group-based interests except whites for so long until that disreputable aspect of it wore thin. And a lot of people said, you know what? I'm not buying that anymore. Everybody else is organizing around their own group interests, and you're telling me that I'm never going to be able to organize. No, I'm tired of that. So I've got group interests too. And we actually have a lot of us here. That's exactly what we're living through now. And I think it's terrible. We've stepped back. We've made real reversals in all of the gains that we had. And Trump is the epitome of this kind of spiteful white reactionary backlash. And of course, you see it in Europe as well. You see it in the UK. You see it on the continent. You see it in France. You see it, there's a kind of international white nationalism that's taking off. Hungary is a seat of this as well, and a kind of inspiration for the new right in America. It's dangerous. It's dark. It taps into some of the worst legacies that we've inherited from Europe. It taps into a deep and dark anti-Semitism that also is, that's enough for another day's conversation. But, these are things that we actually learned last century to put behind us, and that we should really keep in the bag, because these forces, once they're out, you don't know where they lead and where they end. That's not to say that white people are excused and they can only react, but I think that this sword of identity is a weapon that can be picked up and used by anybody. It's not something that you can just use for yourself and your friends, and and the people on the receiving end of it are going to forever refuse to utilize it themselves.
Thomas, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure talking to you.